I think you're on check-ins today, Alana.
Oh, yeah. Cool. Hey, everyone. So we're going to do check-ins, which we practiced last time, which is basically going around and hearing everybody's voice in the room a little bit. And so this one we're going to practice, since we don't have to do self-intros and everything. It's just sort of a quick check-in. And sorry, Susan, I'm just looking at I don't think I'm looking at the right one sheet, but this was the one about describe how you're feeling using a metaphor about the weather. Is that right?
Well, that was an offering, but you can choose your own.
Okay, yeah, that's all right. So, okay, describe how you're doing using a metaphor about the weather, or doesn't have to be metaphorical if you don't want it to. Let's see. I am feeling like it's super raining and gray and horrible outside, but I'm feeling incredibly sunny because I got to have my birthday going out without the baby last night, and just it was a good day. And I went to the gym this morning and it felt good. So I'm a little ray of sunshine on a very gray day. All right. So each person, when you're done, pick the next person. I'm picking Kevin.
Sorry, I have to open gallery so I know who to call next. I would say the same. It feels a little dreary and also quite quiet in the office. Usually it's a little chatty, but everyone's really focused in. I guess there's a lot of work to be done before the holidays. But I'm generally the same. I felt rested after the weekend. And on Sunday, I felt really productive. I actually went through the readings, and I have a few comments to say about it, but I largely found them very insightful. So I'm happy to sort of engage in some nice adult-to-adult discussion on those. Sorry if that seems too cheesy. But yeah, Sam.
Hey, Kevin, it's Jen, by the way.
Jem? All right, did I do it right? Okay, sorry.
So I got out of a 6-hour meeting, and that really sums up my state. And yeah, I'll call Rosa.
Hey, I've had a productive morning instead of kind of feeling weird. There was a members email that was sent out this morning that kind of whacked me a little bit. But I'm just workaholicing my way through the morning. I choose Sarah.
Having just returned from the Bahamas for Thanksgiving last night, my mood is reflecting the weather in Brooklyn right now, which is raining, miserable, and dark. But I'm happy to see your faces. I'm sure you're all going to cheer me up. David.
I'm feeling a little frazzled. Last week I felt like I had everything under control, but over the weekend I got sick. I think perhaps from Thanksgiving. I don't know where I got it from, but I got sick and I recovered quickly, but I got really far behind. So I feel like I lost a day and a half. And I am very glad though that I've prepared for the weather. I just looked outside and I looked at the weather and I called Instacart, and I have enough food in here to last a week. So I have left today, but I didn't feel pressured over the weekend to leave. And so, so I kind of feel cozy and warm inside, but frazzled at work. And at any rate, I feel like I'll have to reprioritize or forgive myself for all the things that get in the way with this class, because as we all, I'm sure, know that sometimes it's the stuff you want to do the most that gets pushed on the back burner. So next would be Conwell. Did you go?
No, I can go. Thank you. I feel the lazy rain weather. I think it's good. It helps me slow down. I'm not one to procrastinate, but I like it when it's raining. It makes me extremely lazy. Not super happy with a lot of the emails that were received, that I received, and just some team members did. So just that. But other than that, still pretty grateful and happy. I will choose Andre.
Hello, good morning. So I feel kind of like sunny, but with a few clouds. I had a friend coming over to Chiang Mai over the weekend, so I kind of traveled around and showed the city, and yeah, didn't really have time for a lot of stuff. Also had to do a bit of work. We have to deliver a project this week. So I got some things done, but I didn't get my personal assignment done, and I'm not really happy with that. So I'll pick that up this week. Tim, did you go?
No, I did not. It snowed like 6 inches in Chicago, so I feel like snow flurries. I didn't do the readings, so I feel guilty, but then I don't feel guilty because we're not getting grades. And then, yeah, I just had like a lot of meetings today, so more of like organizational kinds of tasks instead of like actually producing output, so mixed.
All right, thanks everyone. We've got mixed weather in the group today. Oh, Susan, you didn't do yours yet. Sorry.
I'm feeling like those weird days where the sun is shining, but there's also like this black rain cloud flowing around. Before this, I was on a 2-hour facilitation with another org that is self-managing in the they're in completely different sectors. So they do in-home care for people with disabilities and ongoing mental health issues. There's about 150 of them. And the South Island team from a place called Blenheim, which is beautiful and great wine, are like super sunny and super positive, really challenging themselves. And the team from Palmerston North, which is a less sunny place, I think, did I hear the story once that it was maybe Billy Connell? Oh no, it was John Cleese that said something like, oh, Palmerston North is where you go to die or something. And the town actually named the road to the rubbish dump after him after that. So the road to the rubbish dump in Palmerston North is called John Cleese Drive because he dissed Palmy. But they're like super negative and everything's wrong, and just so curious how infectious an attitude like that is. It's really curious. But the one interesting thing that came from that call that's related to the check-in, because they do practice check-ins. They've been working at this for about a year, and one of the participants said, "Yeah, what I notice about check-ins is they actually signal the start of the meeting," which I thought was really good, because I think a lot of times I think of the check-in as like the thing that you do before the meeting to arrive, but I think just reframing it to think of a check-in as being the signaling the start to a meeting was really cool. So I like that. So speaking of which, let's get into the day. I just need to open the slide screen here.
You want me to share on my screen, or do you want it on yours, Susan?
It's probably easier if I drive, if I'm doing the first part of it. So
Yeah, go for it.
why don't I do that? So as you will have seen from the readers, the theme of this week is building our capacity to collaborate. And the objectives for this week is to understand the importance of communication in a self-organizing team. We're going to do some exercises around deep listening and have that experience amongst ourselves, and to think about how you can start to develop these adult-to-adult partnerships and culture within your team in the spoke and then the mesh. And Alana and I are really thrilled today that our special guest who's joining us at the top of the hour is a pretty incredible fellow by the name of Billy Matheson, who actually kind of taught us about it. So it just seems like an immense privilege to be able to share our mentors with you all. So no pressure on Billy. I'm sure you'll love him. And he'll be joining us at the top of the hour. So as you'll remember last week, we talked about this concept of the onion and how self-management is an onion that starts with mindset And so the mindset of week 2 is really about how do we build this unconditional trust. And a phrase that I'm less comfortable with than maybe I should be, like this idea of safe space. I think it's super important to have a agreed upon place where we can feel like we can say exactly what we need to say and not be judged or ridiculed for it. But I think for me, safe also implies not edgy. Like it kind of, when I think of the word safe, I think of like a big fluffy duvet and just a fire. But yeah, for me, I want safe also to be a place where I'm able to take risks. So I don't know, maybe it's just I do sometimes get myself into loops around vernacular and words. But yeah, so the mindset of how do we create this trust and how do we start noticing our tendencies and our patterns around, parent-child behavior and what it could look like if we all did really adult with each other. And then the principle around this is sort of nonviolent communications, being able to express our needs clearly to each other, again, without fear of retribution or judgment or anything bad happening. We're going to do a practice called listening loops, which will help us each kind of have that experience of what it's like to be listened to from the perspective of the listener and the person listening. And we've got a tool for you to take away, which is a facilitator's toolkit of 7 practices that Kate B. Croft has crafted to help people think about how to implement these communication practices in meetings. And so when we talk about trust, I'm going to hand it over to Alana to talk about the 3 types of trust.
Cool. Thanks, Susan. So yeah. Oh, wait, am I sharing then? Okay.
No, I can share back. It's just, does anybody know how I can share my screen with also being able to see you?
No.
All right. I'll just be in the, oh, I can kind of see you now. All right, go for it.
Thanks, Susan. So yeah, as Susan said, we're going to talk a bit about some conceptual stuff, and then we're going to talk about some sort of like practical applications. So yeah, the 3 types of trust. Can you go back up, Susan?
Yes.
Cool. If you haven't gotten a chance to read the article that this is based on, I do recommend it. It's really short and to the point and clear, and like I appreciate it a lot. If you go on Medium, you'll see like I've got like a bunch of highlights on there from me reading it and going, yeah. So basically, like one issue that I found I run into and people run into in self-organizing networks is basically people mean different things when they say the word trust. And that can cause some miscommunications or breakdowns or conflict. And I thought it's really useful to think about the different things that trust can actually mean in these contexts. So yeah, go read the article, but really briefly, relational trust is basically our relationships with each other, how we treat each other, like some stuff as basic as like not calling each other names, treating each other with respect. A lot of times, I think when we're having a discussion about trust becoming more explicit and people go, can people just use common sense and not be jerks to each other? I think this is kind of what they're talking about, relational trust. So I think that's one level, and we've talked about that a bit, like with our social contracts and our teams and other stuff. And in the article, they give lots of other examples about how this is more of a broader concept as well. But yeah, how we relate to each other as people. The next one is functional trust, how we get stuff done. This is basically how we work together. Stuff like time management, keeping your commitments, having boundaries and saying no if you can't actually do something, clear communication around all of that stuff. This sort of trust is like, for example, very important to me personally, like as somebody who likes to plan things ahead and cares a lot about like reliability of my team members, whereas other people have much more like sort of free flowing styles of functional trust. But the point is not that like one way is more trusting than another. It's that it's a frame for a conversation about how are we going to work together? Does this work for us? Are we going to, keep our commitments around the style that we're working with? And that's another important type of trust, oftentimes expressed in maybe more explicit external processes, like, you know, how do we get our work done on time, or when are we doing sprint planning, all that kind of stuff goes into this functional trust. Flow of value trust is, I would say, perhaps more structural. So this is flow of value trust is about basically a trust that you're not going to screw me over on the level of power dynamics, ownership, money. This is basically like the conversation people get stuck in when they're just starting a startup and they're like, no, we have to figure out the equity split, blah, 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 because we have to make sure we're not going to screw each other over, when in fact there's nothing to split yet because we haven't made anything. So it's possible to like overthink this one too early, but also if you don't have like good ideas and practices around flow of value trust, and you've got either somebody who's like taking advantage of other people or is a bad actor, or just like a bunch of like unconscious or steps that have been taken that ends up with somebody kind of getting screwed, yeah, that can be a really bad situation. So this is about reciprocity, and it is about power dynamics. Like when flow of value trust is going very wrong, oftentimes it's somebody taking advantage or exploiting power dynamics to their own advantage. So I think we literally talk all day about these kinds of trust and how they work in groups, and it's a fascinating topic. But I think for now, what this is just some shared vocabulary, because we're going to be exploring ideas about trust from here on out. It's going to come up a lot in all of your discussions. So this is just sort of a frame or some vocabulary to start to apply of like, what do we mean when we say the word trust? Okay, let's get to the next slide. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, and I realize I'm doing that. I'm throwing a bunch of content at you. The idea is sort of like a shallow view of some interesting concepts, and then we're going to continue to work with them and explore them into the future. So don't worry if this is kind of like all washing over you a little bit. That's okay. This is basically...
sorry,
David?
Yeah, I want to self-advocate. I want to advocate for Kevin. He's in the chat that he doesn't understand the difference between two of them. And if you want to address that later, that's fine, but I just want to make
that's cool. Pop back
make
up.
sure I mention that.
Sure. Can we go back up to the types of trust? Yeah, cool. Basically, like, relational is about how we treat each other. So more kind of in the moment, like, am I listening to you? Am I talking over you? Am I calling you a name? Am I just basically not treating you with respect? Or how are we relating to each other? Is it like quite negative and conflicty, or are we collaborating and trying to have good faith and see the best in each other and the way we are? I think it's much more responsive and in the moment. Flow of value trust. Oh, sorry, can we just jump back to flow of value trust?
Sorry. Yeah.
One more. Flow of value trust, like, is, I would say, more structural. So for example, if the company is successful, are we all going to be fairly compensated? Or if somebody has power, like hierarchical power over somebody else, are they using that responsibly? Do I trust you to like use that responsibly, or are you gonna, as my boss, like steal all my ideas to further your career and like step on me on the way up the ladder or something like that? So I think it has a lot more to do with less about just how are we relating as two people in the moment, and more about the structures that we've created or are find ourselves in how we're working together. Kevin, does that help?
Yeah, I think I'm getting it. I think maybe one, is a more organizational, and the other is a little bit more interpersonal. I think I get the general gist.
Okay, cool. And I'd say, like, read the article, and if you still have questions, I'm like really happy to have a conversation. Like, get me on Slack, or put it in the main Slack and we can have a chat about it. Okay, cool. More stuff in the chat. Let's see. Yeah, okay, that sounds pretty good. So basically, we're gonna be bringing in this concept of psychological safety, and I just want to build up to it with a little bit of the research that is behind it. So basically, the link this week was to this kind of in-depth New York Times article about how Google did this big evidence review and data gathering of their own evidence internally to try to figure out like what actually makes high functioning teams. And that it wasn't like they looked at tons and tons of like, demographic characteristics, or how big is the team, or do they all have lunch together or not, or all these things. And they just couldn't find the pattern because teams all look different, but some are performing really well. And it wasn't necessarily just the individuals who are on the team either. It was like all the complex like relationships between them, the whole being sort of more than the sum of its parts type of idea. And basically they landed on this research, which is from Anita Williams-Woolley and her co-investigators, and this idea of collective intelligence, and actually looking more into what is collective intelligence. It is not just the sum total of all the individual intelligence of the people of the group. It's something else which enables a group to collectively have intelligence and perform well and like work well, collaborate well together, have good relationships, and just to be a high functioning team. And they basically boiled it down to, there are 3 factors that seem to help groups have higher collective intelligence. Average social sensitivity of group members, so that's things like empathy, understanding the state of mind of others, just awareness of others and being able to adapt your own way of being in relation to that. Equality and distribution of conversational turn taking, so that means more people get a chance to speak, not talking over each other, not dominated by just a few people. And the proportion of women in the group, basically. Now, the New York Times article, interestingly, talks a lot about these first 2 bullet points and completely leaves out the 3rd one. So maybe we can leave that for another debate another time. But they go into depth on social sensitivity and conversational turn-taking, and just miss out that this 3rd one was in there. Okay, so this is basically collective intelligence as a concept. Can we go to the next slide, Susan? Cool. So psychologists, when they refer to traits like conversational turn-taking and average social sensitivity, are talking about aspects of psychological safety. So this is a term that comes from psychology, and this is the term that Google ended up landing on in terms of how do we describe high-functioning teams. They're the ones where there's a high level of psychological safety. So here's just a couple of quotes from psychologists about what this is. Like Susan was saying at the beginning, it's basically a team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So that doesn't mean safe as in never challenged. It means it's a safe space for this kind of experimentation, communication, and sharing ideas. Confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. So that's conducive to that sort of environment. Interpersonal trust, mutual respect. People are comfortable being themselves. So this is starting to get into ideas of like bringing your whole self to work, not having to limit the aspects of who you are that you're able to show your team members, and actually, being your whole self in a collaborative team. So psychological safety is now a term that hopefully we can know and talk about. There's lots and lots and lots of things that go into it. Unfortunately, there's no magic formula that's like, just do these 5 things and your team will be psychologically safe. Unfortunately, it's about the sort of messy, complex human aspects of how we are with each other, how we are in ourselves, and how we are in a group. But we're going to talk about some practical ways to apply these ideas, start thinking about how they might be relevant in our home teams, practice them in our teams here. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So we will slow down and have time for discussion and questions soon, but I'll just finish presenting this content, and then we can have some space for a discussion, and we're going to break into small groups and talk as well. So this idea of adult to adult relationships, so the link to the articles and the video about what's called transactional analysis, which is again a term from psychology, which is basically like talking about how humans get into these interactions where they're relating as like a parent type interaction with a child, and people take on these different parent-child roles in different ways. And then there's this other way of being, which is the adult way of being. And the video, which was really good, if you haven't watched it, it's like a 10-minute video that just like really succinctly explains transactional analysis. But it just basically talks about how people get into these interactions where, for example, the example that they give is like somebody's like saying, oh, I can't do this thing, and then the other person's like giving them suggestions, and then that first person's just like, no, I can't do this, and just rejecting everything, and the other person keeps giving them suggestions, and it's this like parent-child thing where like the second person's like trying to save the first person, he's kind of playing the like victim or helpless or whatever, and that basically it takes 2 people to play such a game. Like it plays off of psychological needs, like maybe that childy person in that scenario has a need to feel justified in the fact that they're not doing this, or like it's impossible, and the parent type person wants to feel like they can save them, or they're helpful, or they're more knowledgeable, or something like that. But basically it takes two to tango. And there's this other option, which is like the adult way of interacting, which is basically like, no, I'm not going to play that game. Like, well, what do you think you should do? And just sort of like putting the responsibility back where it lands, and also like fully taking responsibility for your own emotional state and needs and all of that stuff. And we're going to talk about that much more in depth in the rest of this class. So don't feel like you need to understand it all right now. We're going to talk about it with Billy. We're going to talk about it in our groups. But the way that that intersects with this research that Google was doing was this interesting graph where basically if you take this psychological safety and add in the concepts of accountability, which are obviously very important in working together, you can think about this adult relationship and how it works. So that's where accountability is high and psychological safety is high. And you can get into this, what they're called the learning zone, which is kind of where you need to be to have a functional self-organizing team. And I think we've probably all had experience with some of the other zones where it's like accountability is low, but psychological safety is high. That's kind of like you're not responsible for anything that you do. There are no consequences, and like, maybe people can just get away with anything. So the caring parent, and you're sort of a child, or people are children in this scenario. And then on the other extreme, accountability is high, but psychological safety is low. So you can imagine like a really strict hierarchy, or like the military or something like that, where you've got to do it right or you're going to get chewed out. And yeah, so anxiety zone is why they call it that. It's basically like you got to do what you're told. Accountability is high, but you don't have that space to share your ideas or explore or be yourself. Okay, so that was a big information dump. We're going to get into now a little bit more about, okay, how can we start to practice using these concepts? And a big one is how we listen. So basically, creating psychological safety has a lot to do with how we communicate and how we listen to each other. The video that this comes from, which is, again, it's like 8 minutes long, and I found it pretty succinct and to the point, talks about these different levels of listening. It's Otto Sharma, who also does Theory U, if you've heard of that. And talking about how the first three are like pretty familiar to most people, like downloading, listening from habit. That's where you're listening from the frame of mind of what you already know and what you already think. And you're basically only hearing things which confirm what you already think, not really changing your world, not really changing anybody else's world. The next level is factual listening. So he describes this as like kind of like science, where you're listening for things which might disprove your hypothesis. You're listening for disconfirming information. So you have an open mind. You're willing to learn new things, but you're still doing it from sort of the frame of your own frame of reference, your own paradigm that you're starting with. You're sort of comparing things to that and seeing, okay, does this match or not? You might be open to changing your mind. Empathetic listening. So this is like, the first two are really sort of, you're really kind of focused on yourself and your own perspective is the main frame. Whereas empathetic listening is where you really move the frame to what might the person I'm listening to be experiencing. Trying to really see through their eyes, leave your own frame of reference aside for the moment and sort of try to step into their shoes. So for example, if somebody's communicating to you and they're really upset, instead of like reacting based on like your needs or your thoughts, like stepping back for a moment and going, okay, why might they be feeling this way? What might they need to hear? Which is, a different empathetic frame of listening. And then Otto Sharma says that this fourth step, generative listening, is perhaps new to some people, which is basically, the word that came to mind for me when I was hearing his description was transformational, as in you're listening in a way that you could see a completely different way that things could be, with a different way that you could be, or a different way that the person you're listening to could be. So he says this is characteristic of, for example, great teachers or great leaders who will be listening to what you're saying, but what they're imagining is the most like best possible future of what you could become. And they're listening with that frame and responding from that frame. And also, I was thinking also about how that applies to ourselves and how might I be transformed by this listening experience. So these different levels of listening. We're going to be trying this listening looping thing that Susan's about to talk about, but maybe keeping in mind while you're practicing listening and paying attention to what listening is all about, these different levels, and think about, what level you're on, or maybe next time you're in a meeting and you're listening to one of your colleagues, ask yourself, what level of listening are you using, or maybe play at the different levels to see what it could be like. All right. Are these frames mutually exclusive? No, I don't think that they are. Yeah, that's a good point. Although, yeah, if you're really in this like downloading listening from habit frame of mind, where you're really only thinking about, like you're kind of just partly waiting for your turn to speak and partly just listening for something that you can argue with because it doesn't match your like current frame, I do think that would kind of disallow some of the other levels of listening, possibly. But I have a feeling that human beings like switch it up constantly. We are probably very, very good as humans at like fluidly moving between these different levels of listening in different contexts and at different parts of the conversation. So it's probably not like person A always listens at level 4 or whatever. It's much more context based. I'm a hard time understanding frame 4. Would you mind elaborating? Yeah, so Susan, do you want to speak to generative listening a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I get this, it takes practice to get into this space with a group, to be able to actually tune into, yeah, it's hard to, I'm trying to describe the experience of coming into a group with maybe an opinion or an objective, hearing everybody else's kind of reflection or noticing or take on that particular objective, and somehow that, like, it's almost like you can start to see the electricity in the air, and it's like something that you can grab onto that was not there before, right? So something that can only be born as a result of all of the people in the room talking about that thing at the time. I know it sounds woo-woo, and I know it sounds a bit esoteric, but once you've started to experience it, it's like something that you can't unsee. And I think that some of my problem is kind of judging conversations sometimes as to whether or not it can actually get to that point. It's pretty rare, but if you practice, you can get there. Anything else that's different for you, Alana, in that experience? And I'd just love to hear from any of you if you've had that experience, and if you could be more articulate than me in kind of describing it.
I guess what comes to mind is like how you might listen to maybe a younger person, and you feel like you understand, like maybe you've been where they are, you very much understand the issue that they're facing or their environment or how they might be feeling, and you're empathizing with them as well, but you're also listening with this greater knowledge and context of where they could go from here, what they could, like, it's not just trying to understand what is right now, but actually listen with the frame of the path that they are growing on. And yeah, I don't want to imply that it's like, patronizing or anything like that. Like, I don't think it's like that. I think that people, they'll have different contexts in different frames. And there might be times when, like, you are a mentor to somebody, or you are coaching them, or you are teaching them, where it's kind of part of your role to understand not just what they're saying, but the whole frame of where they're at and where they're heading, and sort of listening and responding with that frame in mind, I think is, yeah, another level. Although I feel like I still have a lot to learn about this concept as well, so I might not be explaining it perfectly.
Yeah,
Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I can share a little bit, because the way you're talking about it is generative cannot really happen without empathy. And so I think you use empathy and, of course, all the other 3 levels in order to get to generative. And one of my mentors actually does extreme active listening. And so when you were describing generative, he appeared to me in that he would hold space for me for something new to be born. So if it was, let's say, career progress for me specifically where I want to go, that it would be extreme active listening and a lot of empathy, but a lot of positivity. And it would be a space where no negativity is offered or any reason for obstacles to appear. So removing the obstacles from the way and making sure that you could just think big. So that's just how I felt it when generative was explained, and I hope that explains it a little bit more.
Anybody
Thank
else?
you,
Yeah, go, David.
Yeah, I really resonated with what Susan said about getting frustrated when a conversation may not get to that space, because I'm a musician, and once you learn how to get that spark, that magic, it's very rare and it's in between, far and few between. And it's not always about who you're playing with or how good they are. It's about the context and your relationship with them. And it's very frustrating because, you know, I could be playing with a world famous musician and they may not realize that I'm doing anything. And then it's very frustrating. And at another moment, at the same time, if I give up, it never happens. But I've had that experience where they may even be a friend of mine, but the place is loud or something, and I'm playing. I said, you know what? No one's listening. No one's, you know, being the word here is generative. No one's really trying to create a space together, and that's what I was taught to do: is create a space around you, a bubble, and just let people come into your bubble, and maybe let your bubble expand, but never try to force your bubble around people or pull people in. And that you may end up just sitting there for 3 hours with nobody noticing you have a bubble. But if you really, really, really do that and just really try to find people's bubble, their own space, and you try to not merge it, but just let them see it, they'll like, it's amazing. Like they'll like click in, and it's unbelievable because it can overpower everything and then bring everything into line in the whole room. But yeah, then you just get disappointed, and it's counterproductive because you say, oh, like it was so magical. But then when you try to force it, it never happens. So anyway, that was my biggest thought. Like that, wow, that really resonates with me.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, yeah, that gets into the whole concept of flow state, which is a completely other really big topic of mine. That I might post some things in the Slack about. But before Billy arrives, I'd love for us to get into some rooms and do a little bit of practice. So this is a practice called listening loops. And I love working with Alana because we're back chatting in the Slack room when we actually just changed this to kill two birds with one stone because we're a little bit behind. So in a second, I'm gonna pair you up into rooms, and for 2 minutes, we'd like one of you to name yourself participant A and the other participant B. So participant A, for 2 minutes, will tell your partner about a significant experience about accountability, positive or negative. And then silently think of a score from 1 to 5. Now this is for you, the person that's sharing, about how well you think the other person is listening. Don't share it yet. And after the 2 minutes, the person who's listening, play back to your partner with words and feelings about what you heard. After that 2 minutes is up, the person who shared will give the score to the person who's just shared back based on how well you listened. And if it wasn't a 5, some feedback on how to make it a 5. Then we'll switch roles and repeat steps 1 to 4. Alana, could you copy this and pop it into the chat so it's there, please? And in the meantime, I will create the breakout rooms and put you into breakout rooms.
Does anybody have any questions? And basically the point of the looping back is just to reiterate what you've heard and help the person feel heard. It's not to sort of necessarily add new information. Listening loops is a practice so that like people can feel very heard and we can make sure that we're understanding each other. So try it, and then we'll come back, and if you have questions about it or want to figure out how to do it differently, we can totally talk about it.
Great.
Okay.
And what I'll do is when the 2 minutes are up, I'll broadcast into the room so that you can change from listening to listening. There you go. See you in about 5 minutes. Did Did those broadcast messages work? So did you see
Yeah.
when you were swapping and changing and stuff?
Yeah.
Oh
I thought
yeah.
it was really cool.
Cool.
I lost the instructions in the chat though. But I think those disappeared.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Or
To
maybe, or maybe I wasn't able, or I wasn't looking right or something. But yeah, I had it in memory. So
Nice.
what do you call that?
Buffered.
Photographic memory.
Oh,
That I-
and sorry, everybody comes back, and then Billy's magically here. Hello, Billy.
Hi, Billy.
A little bit early, I'm
Just
afraid.
coming back.
I could go away again and come back in
Hi.
5 minutes.
Hey, we've just done some practicing listening and looping, and we're going to hear from people how it went, and then we're going to get into chatting with you. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, so hey everyone, how did the listening and looping go? What was that experience like?
Humane.
What was that?
Humane. Humane. Yeah.
Nice.
Did anybody get a 5? Get scored a 5?
Nice. Well done. What went into it being a 5?
For me, I think it was the fact that David actually picked up a lot of the non-verbal cues from the conversation, which I was really surprised because I thought that wouldn't happen on a video call. That would only happen on a sort of face-to-face conversation. Literally kind of understood a lot of the things that I actually didn't say and played them back to me. And more so, also showed he was able to kind of attend to those things from personal experience as well. And yeah, again, that added more kind of context.
How did it feel sharing? Did everybody manage to come up with an experience around accountability that felt powerful, either positively or negatively?
For me, it was positive to share. It felt positive.
I must admit that funny that I got a 5 because I found it very challenging to listen without being engaged, and I was nervous that I wouldn't remember what Andre was saying, and I wanted to take notes because I take notes, and sometimes when I take notes I lose track of the bigger picture. I'm assuming I'll create it later, which has a trade-off, and it was very hard, especially because I was, like I said, I was going to be asked for it. So I felt like I wanted to run away or ask or be distracted, and I just re-engaged. And then by the time I played back, we kind of were a little ahead. So we actually did a couple more listening loops, I noticed, on accident. And then I noticed that there were instances I might have empathized or listened actively that I didn't, and I just listened deeply instead, which I was surprised at how quickly I changed that impulse to just run away or respond or capture what they're saying. So
that's a really cool observation, David, that there's listening deeply, listening actively might be somewhat different things and could be called for in different contexts. That's really sweet. Chizan and I were kind of thinking about this accountability discussion also in the context of the transactional analysis stuff we were talking about and how to do adult interactions or short circuit with adult interactions, other people's child and parent interactions, and thinking about, oh, interesting, how might that apply in this course as well? So we've got accountability, obviously us as facilitators, we have accountability to all of you to meet that responsibility, and you all have accountability to each other to be doing your group assignments, and accountability to yourself to do your assignments, and accountability to the whole group to come to the sessions. And I was thinking about, interesting, when we start to apply sort of adult mindset to how we deal with our own accountability and respond to other people's choices in that space. Yeah, if anybody has any reflections on that, I'd be interested to hear. How do we be adults and accountability? And I have a feeling that's going to come up quite a bit with Billy as well. But any thoughts pinging off for people with that prompt?
Maybe like OKRs or something.
You want to say more about that, Tim?
Yeah, maybe just OKRs are an explicit data format, so it's clear and concise as to what the accountability is because it's defined or something.
That's a cool idea. So one idea to like make it a lot more explicit, like what our accountabilities are. And then of course there's still the question of, okay, and what if people don't do it? Then we have a real question about, okay, right, what would an adult do in this situation? Maybe keep that in the back of your mind as we're hearing a bit more from Billy and lots of different aspects of these concepts. Susan, do you want to transition us into the next bit?
Yeah, Billy, I'd just love to invite you to check in with us. So the check-in question for today is, using a weather metaphor, what do you need to say to arrive? I'm assuming that you're in Camilla's nest at the minute, so you've got a view.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Great to join your call. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Susan and Alana for the invitation to spend some time with you all today. I just got back from a couple of weeks in Melbourne. So yeah, settling into a nest, and it's kind of overcast. There's a big front of rain kind of heading its way across the city. It's going to reach us in about 10 minutes, I think. I'm in a great space. I've just had a couple of weeks out of the country, which is always good for us Kiwis to get a little bit of perspective on our island home, and hanging out with some good people in Melbourne, Australia. Had a delightful retreat out in the country there. Kangaroos and emu and cockatoo and all those crazy Australian creatures that they have. And yeah, settling back in for a busy couple of weeks here before Christmas.
Great. Rose is in Melbourne as well. Go Melbourne.
Yay.
So Billy, I'd love just to take, for you to take 5 minutes and kind of introduce yourself. The topic of this week, as you will have seen from the reader, is deepening relationships for enhanced collaboration and trust in teams. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Alana and I, we shared in our check-in how privileged we are to have our sort of mentor in this topic come and talk to us. So just love to hear a little bit about your journey for the benefit of everybody here. And then Alana and I will ask you a few questions and then open the floor for the rest of the team to, you know, explore together.
Billy, we've been talking a little bit about transactional analysis, and also we did an exercise which brought in the idea of competing commitments and that whole process. And both of those I initially learned about from Billy. So it's really, really great to have you here because I've been thinking about those first introductions today. Yeah, so I'd love to hear from you. Who are you? Where are you coming from?
Sure. So I'm a European New Zealander. My people came here from Scotland and Ireland and England back in the day. As part of the European diaspora. I'm a designer by training. I did an industrial design degree here in New Zealand, and my first career was in education. I was a university lecturer for 8 years before setting up a youth leadership initiative and sort of stepping into the social innovation space here in New Zealand. Is how I met Alana and Joshua and the other Inspiral folks. I've worked for city government as a strategic advisor, and these days I'm a consultant. I work with organisations and groups of people to help them achieve their goals. That's kind of the official story, and the unofficial story, of course, is much more interesting. And I think what I'd say, Alana's mentioned transactional analysis, and I think you've seen some of that material. I discovered that in my 20s when I went to see a psychotherapist to try and understand myself a little bit better and deal with some of the consequences of a complex childhood. And she was a practitioner in transactional analysis, and she shared some of those mental models that you've seen.
and it just made a whole lot of sense, and it was really simple. And what I found as I carried on in my career and started working with groups and creating groups, was that those frameworks were not necessarily mainstream outside of the psychotherapeutic profession. And it's a classic example of one domain having developed a whole lot of really useful tools that other domains, particularly in the for-profit space, largely unaware of. And so a lot of what I do is simply because I'm fortunate enough to operate across a wide number of different disciplines, is take tools developed in one place and offer them to another. And there's usually reciprocity there. Those of us that are interested in social enterprise, for example, taking a lot of the tools and concepts developed in business and bring those back into the social domain. So that's really what I do. I just scurry around moving nuts from one tree to another tree like a good little squirrel.
I'd love for you to tell the story, Billy, of regeneration and your youth initiative. And Alana and I were reflecting that, bringing the concept of adulting together to young people that are just leaving school, like what does that enable, and what can that enable in us even in more advanced years, in terms of what that could bring to our experience and our relationship with others and work.
Well, I think the consistent theme for me in a very varied and emergent career has been following the muse of human creativity. So as a university lecturer, I'm working with people from 18 to 30, helping them to step into a design industry, profession. But what I noticed was that as well as acquiring specific skills and practices, there was a major transformation of identity that goes on during those years. People cutting their hair and getting funky glasses and starting to dress in black and all of those things that designers have to do. And what I was hitting, though, as someone trying to support that identity migration, was that as a university lecturer, there was a pretty clear social mandate that I could perceive, where you just don't ask your students about, for example, their well-being or about their beliefs about the world, their philosophical, maybe you can talk about that, but spiritual, probably not, and interactions that they're having with other students. Again, the roots of those are often kind of below the waterline, so to speak. And so at some point I just got sick of that and wanted to create a context where there was more explicit permission to have much harder and more sophisticated conversations with each other. So that led me to leave the mainstream tertiary scene and go and set up another context outside of the mainstream, which had different physics and different parameters. And I think that's that's a story I hear from a lot of people that have created their own work environments or learning environments, professional environments, as they just got sick of the shallowness, for want of a better word, of what the mainstream kind of offers. And it's not that we want to do necessarily different things, but we want to do them and approach them in a very different way. And really the key thing that I would offer you all today is just recontextualizing what you're doing in a relational paradigm. So that although you're trying to build widgets or whatever it is that the task demands, the way you're doing that is primarily through relationships. Yes, there's technical abilities and all of that good stuff. But when we start prioritizing relationships over, or process over outcome, the world changes, would be my offering. And when I look out at the world, so much of what I perceive to be problematic is that it's constantly prioritizing outcomes over relationships.
and that just results in a certain kind of world that doesn't excite me too much.
And what are sort of some more of the details of the how, when you feel like you've created those kinds of contexts and environments where that's possible? How did that come about?
Sure. Well, I was lucky enough in my 20s to be exposed to a number of intentional learning communities, and that can sound a bit jargony, but it's intentional in the sense that they are adults making a decision to gather with each other in their own time, with the goal of learning, and that can be anything you like, really. But that's quite different from the goal of gathering to hang out, or the goal of gathering to kind of download to each other, or the goal of gathering to sort of promote an agenda or promote ourselves. And community, which is, I think generally we think of communities as being place-based, sometimes interest-based, but I think certainly one of the things that what we're doing today is gathering across distance using technology, and that's a very different and very new kind of activity. So these intentional learning communities gave me a sense of what was possible through social process and gathering in a particular kind of way with a particular kind of agenda, using certain tools and ideas. And what I noticed was that as we spent time, and these are like 5-day retreats, as I saw the other people I was working with spending time in these environments, what I noticed was that we were growing up and we were holding each other to account. And it's just, if you're going to spend 5 days with some people, then certain behaviors and activities just can't survive. I'm not going to spend 5 days with someone who's talking all the time, or putting other people down, or doing whatever it is that I might think's not quite up to par. And the cool thing about it is that it won't just be me, it'll be other people noticing those sorts of things too. So there's this amazing opportunity to start supporting each other to a higher standard of behavior. And so that's what I would describe as an intentional learning community. And really what I did was take that and offer that a very similar recipe to a group of young people. And I noticed that made an immediate difference, although quite new to them. They sort of took to it like ducks to water. And there's something, as I always say, we've been doing this for a long time, sitting around campfires, helping each other to get better at who we are.
One amazing experience that I had with you, Billy, was sitting in a cabin in the woods with about 15 other people talking about the topic of stewardship. And before you came on, we were talking about Otto Schalmer's 4 levels of listening, and the difference, or like the leap from empathic listening to generative listening. And I felt very much that experience in that cabin with those people over those 3 days was like a perfect example of something emerging through the generative atmosphere that had been created while talking specifically about a particular topic. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that conversation, and how the conversation about adulting helped us shift into that generative space of understanding what was needed in a way that we couldn't have without having spent that time together.
Yeah, cool. So as I got more involved with facilitation and group process as a way of working, and what's cool about social process is you can kind of speed stuff up. You can play some games, and you can do milling exercises, and you can get people to go off on peer walks, or listening and looping is a wonderful example of how you can speed up the process of getting to know each other and building some trust and deepening the container. At the same time, as much as we can accelerate these processes, I just think there's no substitute for time. There's something, it's just very gentle, and you get to hang out and you kind of feel the people that you have more of a connection with than others maybe. And also over time, you end up having conversations over dinner and realizing that actually that Alana person that I thought was a bit weird is maybe really interested in similar things. So time is a wonderful way of doing that. And I just really, I'm a stuck record on this, I'm afraid, but investing time to spend with each other in person to person, limbic resonance and all of that, there's just no substitute. So I think that, Susan, that's some of what happened over those days. What I'd say specifically about the adulting piece, and using that as a way into the stewardship conversation, is it's really about power and responsibility, I think. And if I'm not taking responsibility, I have very little power. Or if I'm prohibited from having power, it's very hard for me to take responsibility because I have a limited ability to influence. And I think what, for me, the parent, adult, child stuff really helps process is that if the creativity sits with the child and the responsibility sits with the parent, that almost requires us to go into those ego states to utilize those superpowers. And if I'm in a group and what's needed is creativity, and I go into my child and someone slams that, that's going to hurt a lot more than if I can access my creativity from an adult perspective. Or if I see that no one's holding the room to accountability, and the only way I can bring that to the group is to go into parental ego state and start scolding people or, telling people off, that's going to have pretty predictable consequences too. So something about how to bring those things back into grasp or into accessibility from that centered, balanced adult who can be spontaneous and agile, rather than those other two ego states, which are pretty immersive. We can all get our scolding parent on, and we can all get our playful child on. But oftentimes that's not appropriate, particularly in a professional setting, which we're in a lot of the time.
Billy, I have one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the wider group. I think I'm interested in applying these ideas like transactional analysis and these parent and child roles specifically to self-managing teams and non-hierarchical teams. And I think like in a hierarchy, oftentimes people do default to parent-child interaction because that's kind of structurally what's being invited. But how does it all work if you don't have that hierarchy and you're trying to be self-managing? How have you seen this show up, or how can we think about how to be adults in that situation?
This is an inquiry for me, so I don't have a neat, pithy answer. But I think what I would say is that it may be, it may be hard to do that all the time, and I think it's got to be a learning project. So this is sort of what I mean by the process over the outcome piece. And so as hard as it is, particularly under any sort of deadline pressure particularly, but other sorts of pressure as well, we tend to revert. So there's a way, I think, that if we want to optimize these more advanced modes of relating, and I would say adult to adult is pretty rare and special and advanced in a Robert Keegan kind of framework. It's pretty advanced. We have to make space for it, and often when I fail in my adultness in relation to another, it's because there's some sort of pressure. And so there's a lot about context, I think, and just making sure there's some spaciousness and And often a facilitator is a really good way of doing that. It just makes sure we check in, everyone got their needs met, everyone feeling okay, and then I think I find that much easier to show up in a more full way when those sorts of roles are being played, but also when that much attention is being given to context. That's a little bit, Alana, yeah.
All right, from the group, do we have questions for Billy?
I've got one. Hi, Billy. So great to have you. Thanks so much. I find this stuff really fascinating. So it's great to have you. The transactional analysis and the stuff that we've been learning before this class has been really insightful for me. And I think what you're speaking to there about, building these communities, and I think it's wonderful. My team particularly is globally distributed. There are people in Brisbane, in Brooklyn, over in Europe. Do you think it's possible to form those kinds of communities or relationships without being in person? Or do you think that in-person contact and getting that biochemical sort of looping and that sort of stuff happening is fundamental to how we grow those communities successfully?
Yeah, yes, and I mean, it'll be great if you could all have a week together in the Bahamas or something, but
yeah, that'd be nice. I just got back from there.
So given that that's not always possible, I think we really then need to take a strength-based approach to online relationships. And for a lot of people, online is better, we can write to each other, and particularly for those of us that have some introversion and who don't necessarily like the rapid fire of in-person relationships, that can be great. And I think asynchronous communications is really neat as well. I think what happens or needs to happen for the online stuff to work really well is, again, facilitation. So let's all, and agreements. So let's all agree that by the end of the week, we will have written 2 paragraphs on how we're feeling about the project and ourselves. And if you can cycle that role around, that's great. So it really starts to become sort of a group asset. The relationships in the group are an asset that's held by the group. And I think being able to see our faces on things like Skype and Zoom has changed things enormously too, because we can pick up a lot. Our facial recognition software is profound. So, I think that's made the difference probably. And even if you can't, again, on asynchronous, I think even just encouraging a couple of people to meet each other when they can, and then to offer something back to the group about, hey, Sarah and I had coffee in Brisbane, and these are the things we talked about. Here's a photo of us. All of that stuff just helps it be real, I think, for people.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I like what you say about sort of sharing feelings. I think for us in a work environment, it becomes very transactional and impersonal. So I think a lot of that really sort of resonates with me. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question. Maybe it's more though for Susan in terms of how the Inspiral content is going to be delivered throughout the mesh. I was just wondering, are we still a kind of pilot, and then there's going to be a bigger implementation of these concepts more broadly?
So just want to gently correct, these aren't Inspiral concepts. These are concepts that we, through our journeys with Inspiral, have been practicing, but these are, as Billy mentioned, been happening since, we were cave people sitting around fires. So just that. This is no longer pilot. So this is actually the third full cohort of this practice. we're starting to try some additional experiments to implement some of these, or to give people the opportunity to learn and practice some of these processes, these social processes, via things like the self-organizing dojo. There's the other program, Team Foundations, that Joshua Weil is holding. I think he's taken 4 or 5 teams through so far. Kate Beecroft and myself, who are sort of the principal conveners of the SO101 intensive, have had conversations mostly with ourselves about, we feel like that there's something specific about 5 weeks together in terms of really learning and embodying the process and the social process. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question, Rosa, but I hope that we'll be invited to figure it out together, and love to jam with you or anybody else that might have ideas on how we can do that in bite-sized chunks. One thing that I think I know, I hold opinions, but they're loosely held, is that this whole self-organizing, self-management, adulting lark is not something that you can do by yourself. So I want to avoid the excuse of just putting up a library of resource and saying, that's it, we ticked that box. So I think that there is definitely something in the practice, especially with the decentralized mesh. And all of the feedback that I get constantly about how important it is, even just to sit here together for 2 hours. So yeah, sorry, I went off on one.
Well, that was a great answer, Susan. And maybe also to bounce it back to Billy. Billy, how have you seen these kinds of practices or understandings spread in a large and diverse sort of network? And especially because so many of them are learned experientially or in group practice. How do you share them? How do you spread them?
Like a virus. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really it's as simple as gathering, you know, and that can be half a dozen people or, you know, half 100 people. It doesn't really matter. There's something that happens when we spend time together in a defined environment. So you may have heard Susan or Alana using the metaphor of a container, some containment, building a container, and a commitment to be part of a program like this is a container. And then inside of that, really interesting things start happening. And what certainly my perspective as a white European middle-class person living in a modern society construct is, it's so much about the individual, you know, that's the frame. And as soon as we move out of an I frame into a we frame, some sort of defined collective of others, all the flaws and bugs and inconsistencies in that individualistic worldview just start softening up and eventually kind of breaking down. And it's not that it's wrong, like I'm a big fan of individuation, it's really important. But I think the key insight, say from Robert Keegan's work, particularly in the shift from third order to fourth, it is leaving our families of origin, that small town we grew up in, or that particular part of the world with how it collectively saw things. Individuating, really important, autonomy, creating our own perspective, getting a sense of ourself. But and then the next step is back into a collective paradigm, which is very different. And Ken Wilber calls this the pre-trans fallacy. So there's a version of collective prior to individuation, and then there's a version of collective which is post-individuation. And from the outside, they look a little bit like each other, people hanging out in groups, and, you know, you can call them cults, or, you know, you can throw all those sorts of language at them. But actually the interior experience is very, very different. In the first instance, there's not a lot of questioning going on. There's a lot of deference to authority. In the second version of we, post-individuation, everyone has to step up, and it just doesn't, it's a completely different paradigm. But you need to make time and space for that to happen. And it's tricky to start with, and it's uncomfortable, and it's all sorts of great reasons why people don't do it. But having spent quite a bit of time in the personal growth space and a sort of fourth order Western individual, I'm going to make myself better, I'm going to invest in my education, I'm going to see an individual therapist, have a private conversation, or I'm going to go to the gym and have a personal trainer. That whole worldview gets you so far, and at some point it just stops being satisfying. And what are you doing? What are you doing that's working, and what are you finding that's hard? And we just start to want to have conversations with other people, which I think is a much more natural and sustainable way to do not just personal growth, but then it opens up the possibility of collective growth and high-performing team and all sorts of those exciting ideas. But the price is intimacy. And that's hard. It's hard enough doing intimacy with one other person that we love and are attracted to. It's much harder to do intimacy with people that we are deciding to work with, who we might not necessarily like. But over time, in a committed network, you can love people you don't like. And there's a variety of love, which I think is like a professional respect, and that people are their word. I don't have to agree with them, but they say what they do what they say they'll do. They don't badmouth me with other people, and it's a mutual thing, and it can be really nice. So that's really the piece that myself and a number of other practitioners are noticing at the moment, is this how to have a conversation about intimacy in the workplace.
I think
Yeah.
Peter Block talks about that, right? And he talks about that in the sense that we need to elevate if we want to elevate our possibility, elevating that language is maybe some of the first steps to that. Sorry, Conwell.
Oh, was it Conwell?
Oh, was it
I
you?
was going to
Yeah.
ask a question. I love what you're talking about, and I think that the distinctions that you're providing in this context are really helpful as a foundation or a baseline of understanding, mutual understanding. And then my question about like whether these ideas will continue to be kind of spread through the mesh is because I think it makes it easier to have deep conversations and difficult conversations when there's some context and we can refer to particular distinctions. And without those distinctions, I find it can be hard. So I was just wondering, like, if you could speak about how to have adult to adult relationships when you haven't previously discussed with someone, like, I'm practicing having adult to adult relationships, you know?
Yeah. Well, some of the language that Inspiral's developed, and I think this is supported by Peter Block's work on stewardship, is being an ambassador. And if you like these ideas, or if you're working with these sorts of ideas in your part of the mesh, then we can wait for a top-down directive, or that paradigm to support these ideas, or we can play the horizontal card, and we'll I'm going to have some coffees with some key people and introduce them to some of these ideas. I'm going to buy someone the Peter Block book as a gift and invite some conversation around it, or and so that's the kind of the secret agents of consciousness approach, and it's not a bad one. If you can spread the virus amongst your part of the system, then it improves the interoperability that you can have with those people. But it's an investment. It takes some time and some thinking about it. It takes some risks. It's always a bit scary sitting down with someone and enthusing about some ideas that you've come across and inviting them into
into some sort of conversation or practice around it. But I think, the listening looping piece you've just done is a great way to build connection. And what's neat, I think, is when people start asking you back, what are you doing that's working? How come you're presenting so differently? Or how come your team's got such a good vibe at the moment? Well, let me, yeah.
That really resonates with me a lot, because I struggle with these same things. And I was wondering about listening looping, and I learned to practice in a workshop over the summer, which was called listening tours or perspective tours, where you not only go to share, but you actually set up very brief 15 to 20 minute coffees, and you tell them what perspective you want or what perspective of theirs you don't understand, and you push back with questions. And the more I do that, the more people, they just start scheduling more for me to listen to them. And then eventually I reach critical mass where I've listened enough to have an opinion. And then whenever I try starting with opinions with a new person, it never works. Like, the look on their face is they're not interested. So we could speak more about that. It's very challenging. And eventually you end up with a 4-hour call with someone because you have to. So, but it's very rewarding, but it's very siloed. So it's not like a virus. It's more like you said, like I'm taking care of myself and my connections. And I don't feel like it's spreading. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, Tim, Jem, Conwell, Andre, love to hear your voices in this conversation. Kevin, I don't know if you'd be willing. You said that you'd had some questions in reading the material. That what I read into what you said was that maybe sitting a little bit uneasy with some of it.
Sorry, I was muted. I guess the one that I was specifically talking about is this kind of like levels of like, it almost seems like self-actualization, right? About like, yeah, what can you sort of distance from yourself, and like what is sort of like part of what your being is, like the level 1 through 5 stuff. And I thought from like a basic level, it made sense, right? It's like, yeah, levels of like, how can you become the better individual that can evaluate things objectively. But like, I guess, yeah, there are minor complaints. Like the first one is just like the percentages just seem very arbitrary, right? And the second one is, and I think this was pointed out in the comments. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can you lift your camera a bit so we can see your face?
Oh, sorry.
Right.
Okay.
I do like your shirt. And which percentages were you talking about?
Just like the distribution of like which people on Earth have attained this kind of level of like, this kind of these levels, right? And I just thought it was just a little weird that they just, it's just like whenever I see 1% of anything that applies to a population, that just raises flags to me. But that's just a minor complaint, right? That's just nitpicking. I thought that the more important and interesting one is like how in the comments someone pointed out that we sort of like flow through these states based on where we are and who we're interacting with. And so I think they pointed out that, yeah, you can be like a level 3 with, a level 3 in interacting with your coworkers, but a level 2 in interacting with your significant other. And so I thought it was cool just to be able to examine the dynamics of how your maturity can kind of fluctuate based on your environment. So sorry if I didn't give a lot of context, but.
That's great, Kevin. I think you're making a really important point, which is, for me, is the context piece. And I think David named it well too. If you invest some time in creating a social field, you can have a different kind of experience. Similarly, if you show up with your professional coach who's really invested in you being the best you can be, strangely enough, in their company, I'm a better person. When I go home for Christmas and it's all going on, then I revert back to how that is. So this is another point that I really want to make about intentional gatherings, and even spaces like this, is that they can offer us a temporary experience of being at a stage of development that we don't manage to be in most of the time. And that's great, I reckon. It's like it's like going to the gym in lower gravity. All of a sudden I can do a bunch of stuff that I just normally can't do. It doesn't necessarily make me stronger, but at least it's a chance to practice and rehearse, and I know that it's there. So when I'm back in the day-to-day, I can orient towards it, and I can help other people kind of orient towards that possibility as well.
Interesting. Not really, you were so prescient. Not only did you know that Sarah had been to the Bahamas, but you knew somehow that one of the conversations we were having at the beginning was about kind of getting addicted to the bliss of being in group where this stuff always happens and how it doesn't always happen. Couple more questions for Billy.
I think Jem, you wanted to jump in, didn't you?
So I really like. I'm really interested in the idea of like how like temporarily we can change spaces, change like stages of like which level we're in. But then like, what would you like recommend doing like every day to always be in like the stage 5? Like, is there something like what kind of like thought should we be in? Like, what should we push for?
Well, certainly when I did the training in the Keegan material, they made the point that when you look at the model, we're all in stage 5, because that's what being in stage 5 is a little bit like. You can see all the previous stages, whereas if you're in stage 4, you can only see the previous stages, and if you're in stage 3, you can only see the previous stages. So I think any practice that helps you grow a witness, grow that meta-awareness of how am I feeling today? How's the weather today? How's the workplace feeling today? How are my colleagues today? Mindfulness, wonderful practice. Having a check-in with someone, wonderful practice, because it forces us to deal with what is arising. But any of those practices take some time to participate in. And so even just, having 5 minutes of pause before you start your day and noticing what arises. You might want to write it in a book. You might just want to look at it, let it go. But that's the individual version of a lot of these group practices we've talked about: checking in, listening, looping, gathering. I think I feel like my culture supports the individual stuff fairly well. Buddhism's got a lot to offer, yoga's got a lot to offer, journaling, morning pages. There's just a whole bunch of really cool practices that work when you do them long enough. What I think we don't do so much is then take those into a collective space, because often they're deeply personal, and that's not kind of how we roll.
So basically the hard part is taking that mindfulness from your relationship with yourself to relationship with others.
Yeah, and not getting them confused. Both are important, and I think both reinforce each other. Would be my offering. So the group is not the replacement for doing our personal work, but doing our personal work actually doesn't necessarily help us a lot in a group setting.
Billy, one of the things I've always appreciated about you is your capacity to hold conflicting truths at the same time, or hold the paradox, sit with the paradox. And one way I've noticed you doing that is with this adulting thing, in that, one moment you can be able to explain the adult thing and demonstrate the adult thing, and then next moment there's also the aspect where it's like, and here's the way that I'm still the child, or here's how this is. It's not like you learn to be an adult one day and like that's it, now okay, job done. No, it's this like constantly flipping paradoxical process of lifelong learning. I don't know, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and how you hold that in your own journey.
Yeah, I think it's like riding a bicycle. It's that ability to be balanced. But riding a bike is not at all useful if all you can do is go in a straight line. So what they talk about a lot with TA is spontaneity. You know, if I'm an adult, I can go left, I can go right. You know, I can step into authority, compassion and discipline being the sort of the two versions of adulthood. I can step into free child and adaptive child when I need to, and so I've just got all these choices. But similarly, if any time I freak out, it's going to be an instant, you know, jerk into one or other ego state, then that's a problem. And it feels like a similar wisdom to an aspect of Buddhist teaching, which is the middle way, you know, between being wealthy or being an ascetic, having nothing, and actually neither extremes are that useful. So I think the paradox is my compass when I'm working with groups. It's just when there's a, you know, sometimes it shows up as conflict, sometimes it shows up as confusion. How can these two things be true? But for me, they're like posts on a gateway. It's just great. Let's just try and get the middle. It's not a compromise middle, but include and transcend. How can both of those things be true and something beyond them is probably the interesting bit. And the piece that I'd say, I think, Susan, you mentioned the bliss conversation. For me, the opposite of the bliss conversation is the shadow conversation. And that's a beautiful way into a paradox of, yes, we've just had this ecstatic experience or this transcendent experience together. What was dodgy about it? You know, what didn't work? Who felt uncomfortable at some point? Because again, both of those things are true. Then you have that balance, and I think ultimately a deeper experience of reality rather than, oh, that was amazing and perfect, or that was lousy and flawed. It's just normal human being in the world. Yeah.
Susan was telling us earlier about she's working with two teams, one who's super sunny and one who's really negative, and that just makes me think, maybe, Susan, maybe you need to get the positive people to think about the shadows and the shadow people to think about the sunshine.
Yeah.
Thanks, Billy, that sparked that off for me. Susan, do we have more time for questions, or do we need to start wrapping up?
We need to start wrapping up. Yeah, just so much gratitude for you, my friend. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me on your call today. Full respect to all of you for signing up for this sort of stretch activity. You're in really good hands, and I wish you all the best with your endeavors.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Billy.
Bye.
See ya. Wow, just like thinking about that, I'm wondering, how would you all feel about maybe if I did a little bit of an edit of that and shared just that conversation a little more widely with the mesh? Or does that feel too weird?
Let's do a Rumio, thumbs up or thumbs sideways or thumbs down, and you are allowed to say no, by the way. Guy, looks like thumbs up.
Nope. Conwell,
okay.
You want to talk about that, Conwell?
Okay, so I think it's pretty awesome that Billy came and talked to us, and I think it should be shared. I guess like the question that I was afraid to ask, and I guess I'm opening it up to the group now, is how do all of that we talked about today, from parent-child adult relationships and to this 4 levels of listening, while we talk about them and we can apply it with our wonderful group here, how do we really apply this in like a hostile working environment? And then the question is, how do we even change the mindset in that hostile working environment? So I just felt,
sorry,
because
you got a hostile working environment, like this stuff, this self-management stuff, like this relational stuff, this self-work and group work stuff, like when you've got everybody on board and everybody trying their best to be the best version of themselves, it's still freaking hard. If you're in a hostile environment, I would say 100% not safe to roll any of this out. You will get crushed. Don't do it. I've gone there. Don't go there. Maybe Susan will have a more optimistic view, but I would say if you've got a hostile working environment, you've got levels that are so much more basic that need to shift, whether that's structural, that's probably structural, but sometimes interpersonal or whatever's going on there. Like if you don't actually have equal power with everyone else, don't try any of this stuff.
Yeah, so I think that was just something I was thinking about the whole time as everyone else was sharing their stories and their comments and asking questions. It's like, how do you apply that when you don't even have equal power and authority? And we talk so much about decentralization. And I think something to really think about here too, even going in this course, is are we really talking about like a decentralized working environment? So I'm just laying out a couple of questions, but that doesn't mean we need to answer them. I think I'm just bringing that up. But totally we should share Billy's portion with the mesh and with everyone else.
Thanks for bringing that up. It's a really, really good point. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing. I think it hits a very important point that I have noticed in my perspective tours, that I have not been in a hostile working environment because I was warned about it before I joined, and I've built a protective bubble of adults around me and ran far away from any non-adults, if you use Billy's terms. But I am aware of many different micro or macro hostile environments. But my question would be, Kanwal, when we were asked, should we share, and you were hesitant, and you expressed that you just wanted to clarify your feelings, but I want to take a step back and say, was there a part of you, like, I want to know why you felt they were connected, like sharing versus practicing? And like, so one possibility is, did you perhaps feel that like you get targeted for being seen on a call like this? Or what was your connection for why sharing it could lead you to feel hopeless or afraid of, like Alana said, the toxic consequences, or don't do it? So what was that connection for you? Because I feel like it could be very important that other people here or in the mesh would feel in a similar situation.
Well, I think I'm probably speaking more from like Sam Popsy's email sent out today, and I think that's just in the back of my head. So I usually speak on behalf of the group as well, rather than myself. And I think, yes, like, of course, you would get targeted as an individual to even like bring something like that up, or just bring any other experiences. So I feel like the work we're doing on self-organizing, it's so wonderful here. And I want to take it back to my team, and I want to take it back to Mesh, and I know everyone here wants to. And we want to empower this work. But I think a part of me then, I think it was just David, I think I was trying to put myself in the shoes as I'm learning about this, and if I were to take it back to my team and educate them on it, how would that be received, one? And then really, I think that put me in a place to think about, are we in a parent-child adult relationship with each other, with certain leaders? And so I just felt like a need to share that. But perhaps I have to think a little bit more about that and ponder and journal.
It also seems relevant to the discussion we are having about the different types of trust, and are those different levels of trust actually in action in your work environments? And trust is like I would say prerequisite to all those types of trust, really are a prerequisite to any of these practices. So those things aren't in place. There's, I guess that like prerequisite foundational work, or pointing out that it's not a conducive environment for any of this is, man, I just have a lot of empathy for people who are stuck in situations like that. And I've myself been stuck in situations like that, and I immediately go to like, run, get out while you still can. But that's obviously probably not super constructive in this context, but I'm just saying, like, modulate your own sense of risk and vulnerability against the reality that you're working in. And I don't think it's not worth like martyring yourself over any of this stuff. Okay, I've said my piece.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you for empathizing and really being on point there.
So my perspective on what I heard you say, Conwell, was this shift from valuing what we're saying, wanting to share it, how it resonates in the mesh with an email you read, and then this sense of wanting to bring it and almost getting like triggered by the negativity to then just like get caught in this panic of like, uh, what would happen if I actually did it? And panic may be my word because that's my not default state, but it used to be. So uh, I said it with like empathy that like, yeah, I think I agree. Like if I was in a bad situation, I would start to forget that like sharing a video was not the same as forcing my team to love each other and then getting fired or something. But it feels that way. Uh, and without saying too much from my perspective, tours, a good quote that I got was when about the mesh is that when people feel traumatized, they hold it in. And it shows up in different ways. And I don't use that word lightly. It could be little t trauma, they call it. But, you know, we see these toxic environments cause people to kind of want to pull in. And it's like Lana said, it's not always clear how to push out, you know. But when you create a safe space, like Susanna said, like we can be we can be your sounding board where you at least don't feel toxic. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard. So.
Yeah, or maybe we could be your arbitrators. What do you call it? Mediators. We got you.
You guys are awesome. David, I'd love to talk more about how to push it out. I think that's like a skill set to have. And so I'll probably reach out. And if you have some time, that would be great to learn to do that. And the skill set that you were earlier talking about, I think that was very special.
And in full disclosure, I have comments I could share about the email, but I would never share while it's being recorded in this session. And so I will share it, but I don't want it recorded. So I feel the same kind of like, there's no way anyone can hear what I have to say about this yet. But so I'm the same way. And sometimes it's very, like Alana said, I think it's very important that I not say these things when it's being recorded. But
maybe someday soon we can have an off-the-record group discussion.
Or maybe that's like what the separation is between the relationship between yourself and relationship between the organization. I don't know. Maybe not.
Oh yeah, I'm afraid of my relationship with the organization. That's why I won't say what I'm thinking. It could put me in danger. And it's not an opinion. It's what I know. I know too much. So I'll shut.
Right. To be very important discussions, starting points to be continued. Susan, are you going to talk about the assignment before I run out of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So got 2 assignments this week. They're a little bit less heavy than last week, though I still would encourage all of you to complete your assignments from last week if you can. So this week, the individual assignment, after reading it through and watching the 2 articles and watching the video on transactional analysis, I know some of you have and some of you haven't. Your task is to spend some time thinking and journaling about your parent-child tendencies. Thinking about when you revert to childlike behavior, thinking about when you become a bit parental. And then analyze 3 relationships in your life, could be with anybody, and pick a relationship where you typically play child, typically play parent, and typically adult. And then just answer the following questions. What role, describe the role you play, why does the dynamic occur, do you want it to be this way? And if you want it to change, what's one action that you could take in the particular dynamic or in the relationship that could move it towards adult to adult? And then the group assignment is to meet up with your team and discuss the following questions. This is more specifically around the listening culture of your team and spoke, and then noticing parent-child dynamics going on either in relation to each other in the team or in relation to the mesh. And then we'll come back Friday, and each group will be asked to present their insights or patterns that you've harvested from these conversations. And I'll share this editable assignment sheet in the Slack when we're done here. And that leaves us 2 minutes to check out. Alana?
I guess I'm just yeah, walking the line between like loving my own authentic emotional engagement and feeling the need for professional distance or something like that, and just realizing that's can be a productive tension. Yep, great session. Thanks everyone.
I'll jump onto that. Yeah, this is like the constant paradox in the work that I do. I feel like I can't authentically do the work without a level of intimacy with y'all, but also kind of recognizing that even though the relationship is all in, it's just different. But also, I'm not a therapist and I don't pretend to be one. So I think that's an important distinction as well. And feel like if you'll welcome me and you'll have me, and I just want to be in it with you. That's me. Jem.
So to check out, I think like today like made me think about like deep listening a lot more, and like especially the generative one that kind of like struck with me. Um, like I remember taking like improv classes in college, and like the probably like the teacher like focusing on like listening as if you have to like tell the whole story to CIA. So like you have to be very active, but that's like some like thing that some practice that you like forget like month to month. And so like I really appreciate how like this like class I say like reminded me how to like listen deeply, actively, and now like generatively. And also like this like transactional analysis. I think I'm gonna go forward and watch like the videos on like more. There like I think there's a channel, and like the channel continues on watch like videos on like the transactional analysis. I think I'm gonna keep on like watching those because the subject is definitely very interesting. Rosa.
Super interesting conversation, and I'm grateful to have been on the call today, and I feel far more in my body and relaxed and mellow than I did at the beginning of this call. I choose Sarah.
Yeah, I think the listening segment was really important. I mean, I'd heard of like active listening before, but to take it to that next deeper level, I think is really important, particularly in the remote first, always on video kind of environment. It's so easy like to be on a meeting and not really be paying attention and have all these distractions in the background. So I think that's definitely something I'm taking away. Yeah, I really enjoyed the transactional analysis videos. I definitely recommend everyone watch those. And even after watching them on the weekend, like today, I was like, oh, that was so child, and now that's parent. So it's kind of a really cool just thing to notice. So I'm looking forward to sort of like taking further action with that and sort of improving my relationships. So yeah, that was good. And it was great to have Billy. He was just great. So thanks for organizing that. Tim.
All right. I feel really privileged to be able to attend a meeting like this and have all you specialists, psychology and self-organizing, and the influential man who just joined us on the call. And I look forward to catching up on the readings and watching the videos. I had read some from last week, and yeah, I think the most important thing I learned from this one was, yeah, the deep listening, and it's something I can definitely practice. Kevin.
Okay, cool. So I like how a lot of this reminds me of when I went to coding boot camp like 2 years ago, because it was called Dev Boot Camp, and a lot of it focused not just on how to code, but also how to like interact with people. And they really valued sort of like, yeah, emotional intelligence, right? And I feel like a lot of what we're talking about here is just trying to identify what kinds of emotional intelligence systems we're in, to put it very vaguely. So I really sort of like value that time before, and so now that it reminds me of that, I'm just getting this very nostalgic feeling. And yeah, I just feel like sometimes in the work environment, it's so very hard to like forget that like it's not very natural how to work with people, that there is an art to it, and especially in a decentralized organization. And so, yeah, I'm just really happy that I'm participating in this, and yeah, just learning all these new terms that people are using. Cool. Kamal.
Thanks, Kevin. So I feel the same way because I went to like a boot camp as well. I went to Startup Institute and I'd done technical marketing, and it has, this group has that feel of like coming together and working together and holding each other accountable. And of course, a lot of gratitude to be able to do this with you guys. Yeah, I'm very, very curious about the generative listening piece and how to get there, and how to do that properly. And then I think one thing, there were many things that resonated with me, but I think something I probably think more about, which was said, you can love people you don't like. And I'm just really curious to explore that further. Thank you, everyone. Andre.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, it was really interesting. A lot of things, especially like Tim's discussion. For me, like one thing that really kind of stands out at the moment is when you say like the price for high performing teams is intimacy. And to be honest, I struggle with that. And I think one thing that I'm learning here is to kind of be better at that area. Since I find it, normally it's like, you know, in like face-to-face interaction, I find it easier, but within a team environment, and especially remote, it's not so easy for me. And I'm learning a lot in this class. So, and I was just thinking, like, actually me not doing my personal assignment this week is probably more to do with that rather than kind of, you know, excuses about not having time, or, you know, so it's about like kind of avoiding, you know, sharing some, you know, some of like intimate stuff, and, you know, being vulnerable and so on in front of, you know, my colleagues. So yeah, so I think I'll get better at that. I'm learning a lot. So I think there's no one else apart from me. Am I the last one? Oh, David. Sorry, David, it's you.
Check out, I really enjoyed today's session. It challenged me a lot to listen without the ability to capture or forget. But and I really appreciate everyone's comments and the discussions that are starting. And my generative experience was the first session, and I felt like I was watching the seeds of change in the mesh either be planted or being created. And I think that this group, and hopefully the other group, we will all together with the next cohort and the next cohort, perhaps not be a virus, but like an embrace of loving people, an embrace of love, including the people we don't like. So that was just my reflection, is that it's a good group. Like Tim said, it's a privilege to be among you guys. And so I hand this off to checking out and be done.
Thanks, everyone. Great session. The worksheet is in the Slack. I'll post the video. I'm going to ask Alana to edit out the Billy piece and post it on the SO Jojo channel. And we'll be around in the Slack. Make sure that you meet, and we'll see everybody on Thursday/Friday.
I have a quick food for thought. Like, just before we leave, like thinking about deep listening and listening very deeply can actually lead to like paradoxically like anxious thoughts about like not being able to listen. And that happens to me quite often. But I just want to put that out there.
Thanks, Jem. All right, thanks everyone. It's been a great session. I'll see you next time.
See ya. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.